Okay, I'm going to be touching on a lot of things that I've been talking about for a long time, but also perhaps tie them into a more overarching, integrated view of these psychological models and the components therein. You know, I must sort of honestly confess that in focusing on this, thing that I'm calling homosexuality signature, which is more related to, I would think, sort of developmental um, sort of stumbling blocks, in terms of for already somewhat functional false ego complexes. So, sort of the ordinary forms of developmental obstacles and challenges that people that develop. And just going back in my mind, I must say I can't really remember everything that I said about narcissism, but I mean, obviously, it has something to do with that they don't even have a well-established ego, that they have a kind of, that they need some kind of external buttressing, or they need some way to have, in some sense, if they even have a subconscious, they have a subconscious in the context of the reflection of other people's ego contribution. So they have a kind of assisted subconscious, or they have an assisted access to a subconscious which is itself, which in some sense I think makes them addicted to a kind of ego drama, that they have to knit together their ego with other people's ego to supplement their own sort of insufficiency within their own ego. And that insufficiency will probably have to do with the child function. And the reason why I was thinking about this somewhat recently, it was also because I was watching a Sam Buckman video, was because, at the end of the last recording, I started talking a lot about, in some sense, I was meditating on general ideas of how to integrate the sides of the mind and overcome the false ego complex, and what really is the fundamental toxicity of the structure itself. Because in some sense, I think that the spiritual challenge, or the challenge of having an integrated psychology, or a maturation, or and a fundamental sort of self-actualization and integration of these components, is that you have to put the mark of your ontological process, the process that you have to retrace the ontological steps taken in the fundamental formulation of the false ego complex, and you have to somewhat overcome those innate structural. You have to overcome the mark of your let's say, it's almost thematically similar to the concept of original sin, that essentially, the way that consciousness gets itself off the ground is through the false ego complex, and you have to sort of go back and clean and retrace and clean up sort of the sloppy, because you can't have a perfect upbringing in some sense, so you have to supplement the lack of perfection and some kind of utopianism with a real understanding of what these things actually mean, in some sense. And I mean, in some sense, there's even a side of the mind that, in some sense, is fully, that's all that side of the mind represents, which is the unconscious side of the mind. So I'm going to talk a lot about the unconscious side of the mind, and it's going to relate both to developmental problems, but also I think it's useful to talk about in conjunction with narcissism. Because I think that all young people that are developmentally growing up in the world, I think that they are, although that they don't have, let's say, the same kind of, they don't have the same kind of dysfunction and deficit that's, like full-blown narcissists have. I think that in some sense, there is a fundamental phase of growth and development within the false ego complex, which roughly is equivalent to narcissism. So, I mean, this just comports with the idea that narcissists are persisting in an early stage of development which they can never graduate from, essentially, because they lacked some kind of fundamental way to. But anyway, in terms of how they orientate themselves, in terms of having a subconscious, in terms of how they are connected to their subconscious through this kind of ego assistance, that their subconscious is perhaps also sort of doubled down into helping structure and facilitate this kind of or different tactics and strategies for having a kind of a hobbled ego that needs to garner some kind of buttress so that it can have access to what is essentially an externally supplemented subconscious, in terms of sort of in terms of a strange epistemological substrates or foundational, sort of delineation of how it functions, which is sort of an inculcated dysfunctional apparatus or whatever. But that is what is generally naively being done by very young children themselves, because they don't, and this is the thing, they don't have a matured or developed unconscious side of the mind. And this is a fundamental, sort of problem that we all suffer from, because we're not born into the world with a perfect unconscious side of the mind. Obviously, I have to cash that out in my jargon and my terminology, what I mean by the unconscious side of the mind. But I mean, if you follow my recordings and things like that, but I'll just say that, so the unconscious side of the mind is, I've called it generically the source of mystery, or the actual, sort of, because, and it really has to do with, if you can say that the subconscious is the library of your belief systems, and in some sense everything is relatable to beliefs, so everything can be reducible to a subconscious schema. The unconscious side of the mind is in the same way that the greater of the lesser and the lesser of the greater segments of the divided line in the Platonic structure, I would relate that the subconscious is like the greater of the lesser, and the unconscious side of the mind is the lesser of the greater. And how I think this, how Platonism is to be properly understood, is that the third segment of the divided line is the source of the second segment. That always and the ideal forms, which is the greater of the greater, is the source of it all. So it's sort of, as you go up the divided line, it's always, the next segment is always the process that derives and populates the content of the side that came before it. So anyway, to put it, so what is the source of beliefs? Well, the source of beliefs are the principles that govern the operation and processes of reality. So the mystery, which is generically, I call it the mystery, because before you have beliefs, developed understanding about it, it's just going to be mysterious. But the more you know about it, the more it develops, the more you understand principles, and the more you understand, well, some principles are greater than other principles. They are of a first sort of variety, but principia, the first things. Principles are the first things. They are the things that give rise. And so what then the principle, or the unconscious side of the mind, is in context, then, in some sense, it is the context of belief, the source of belief, the process, the model of a process, which, so the thing is that the subconscious is going to be fundamentally beholden to an external locus of control, which is ultimately going to find itself constellated around the superego. So the superego is going to continually rule the positive development of the false ego complex until it is supplanted by the unconscious side of the mind. And I think many people never develop they never grow up, they never mature their unconscious side of the mind enough to actually have a real internal locus of control. And this is kind of like the issue of spiritual education or metaphysics or philosophy, you know. And so, so I think a lot of people, they don't develop principles because they just believe in the narrative of scientism or determinism or fatalism. They have either some kind of sort of false religion. I would call all of those things sort of, very bad solutions to the fundamental mystery, or the generic mystery that has to be cashed out. I think, as essentially principles. And you end up with either principles that end up devaluing themselves, or you end up with principles that support, the ultimate sort of principle of, let's say, either sort of liberty or self-determinism. The freedom of choice and such like that. Now, the thing that is interesting, and I've said it, sort of what I call perfecting the vanity, in terms of developing something, is that, perhaps growing up does somewhat require taking the unconscious inferior function and using it to damage the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind, so that the unconscious side of the mind's dominant function builds back better, and then the vanity is cleansed or perfected, so the vanity gets perfected. Now, when the vanity has this, let's say, spiritual education within it, in terms of the unconscious side of the mind, I think that if it can give the subconscious side of the mind independence from the superego, then you actually have, let me just make a big metaphor. So in the Matrix, right, you have the machines controlling everything, and even they allow the resistance to exist because it's part of the control mechanism. It's like, you don't let the revolutionaries you don't try to crack down on them. You let them resist. You let them play their game, because somehow that sort of, I guess, it's unwritten in the script, but sort of it lets the system works better when it thinks it's capable of evolution. It thinks that it's capable of sort of having some grand metaphysical drama, even if most people never know about it. That they're part of a system that is more dynamic. And so having a Zion, having, sort of these people that hack into the Matrix and that are seemingly working towards the liberation and the end of it, sort of makes everyone sort of, the quality of their dreams and the system of control is better maintained, or something like that. Anyway, so a bit of a strain, but anyway, my point is so I would say that the unconscious side of the mind would somewhat in the Matrix be represented by the Oracle, who, is called by the architect the mother of the Matrix, but also, that she seems to have this independent principle where she is actually interested in cultivating her special children into being able to potentially evolve the whole system. And in some sense, the independence of that principle, in some sense, that supersedes the structure of control, grants, let's say, if you would take Neo to be a representative of the subconscious, grows and inculcates and fosters the subconscious to think itself beyond the confines of the ontological creation of this whole system, which which in some sense that the ego was created at the behest of the superego, and the superego in some sense is just trying to solve a problem. It's just trying to sort of overcome some basic trauma, or sort of is obsessed with something like that. And in some sense, the ego is just the mirage of the Wizard of Oz, and the superego is the man behind the curtain. And playing with the mirage of the wizard is allowing this sort of this game, this adult performance of and the actual concerns of the man behind the curtain who can't get home because he's stuck in a foreign land, and all he has is this insulating illusion and mirage that he's casting in order to survive. The Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain, is really just another damaged, self-insulating purveyor of coping using the mirage of the wizard. So in this analogy, the ego is the wizard. And the subconscious, I guess, would be Dorothy. And the the companions, or something like representatives of the principles of the unconscious side of the mind, that are perhaps inculcating enough independence for the subconscious to actually look behind the curtain. Okay. But okay, so the thing that most people don't seem to develop in their life, as it were, is or let's say one of the great sort of stumbling blocks is that their unconscious side of the mind is not well enough developed to provide the principal tools that the subconscious can ground itself within, can frame itself within, to essentially displace itself from living in the narrative of the mirage of the ego, which is essentially the curtain of the superego. So in some sense, the subconscious is fundamentally constellated around the superego until its unconscious side of the mind can foster it an independence, and in some sense a kind of a solid purchase to having an independent belief system that's capable of being a glitch in the matrix, that's capable of going against and unweaving, sort of the narrative program that the whole thing has sort of inherited from the fact that the ego itself is the curtain of the superego, and therefore everything, all the structures somewhat inherits that taint. But the unconscious side of the mind can unlock enough independence within the subconscious that the subconscious can essentially eventually get the ego to let's say self-actualize, despite its ontological beginnings. And if the positive, what I call the positive development of the false ego complex, as in the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego, if those can be integrated and healthy enough, then perhaps that they can go and sort out the superego. They can be the model of the solution of the superego in their independent development. So it's interesting, because what I'm essentially saying is that in some sense these are all parts of yourself, but the superego is a different kind of part to yourself, because it is a separate. There's a basic fracture here, that the superego is holding all the cards, and it's created you, which is a puppet within a game, and then can that puppet within the game generate enough independence and forethought to actually confront the puppet master and to actually solve its problem, and so already, this sounds quite crazy on some level. It sounds like, I'm talking about Well, it certainly sounds confusing that, there are these sort of internal layers of sort of a fundamental self-deception in terms of one's own core essence. But essentially, the superego is fundamentally problematic because it is almost it's a sense of self which is kind of like an environmental cloud. The parent function of the superego, at least. But what I think is what makes the superego more personalized is probably looking at it from the perspective of the child function of the superego. Yeah, so I've been thinking about these child functions, and I think it is actually a much more efficient way of cleaning up one's own internal psychology, because I've been looking at this from the structural perspective and how these things interrelate to one another. But now I've just recently started confronting within myself, sort of the child function I've always related to the lust. And I think that what they are, this is also spoken about within Scientology, is that these are the sort of the aesthetic images. They are conditions that relate to the cognitive function related to the child function that are just kind of like motifs. They are like snapshotted frames that seem to hold great power or have a kind of inbuilt purpose, value, structure that is just kind of axiomatically accorded to that snapshot, to that image. And so that they're fundamentally, they are frames of they're almost, I think they're sort of they're idols in a but I think that it can be often, in some sense, when you examine them, you realize just how ubiquitous they are in terms of how they have been governing the orientation, the motivation, the purpose. In some sense, it's the most salient kind of it kind of gets lost in the weeds of the dominant function. And I do think that they get very disguised by all these different sides of the mind, because you can focus on how the parent function is dealing with the inferior function of between these relays between themselves, and you kind of lose the fact that essentially it's all in devotion to these child functions. That all the other stuff is just the drama surrounding the facilitation of these child functions, which are so simple and inert, and in some sense you're sort of just taken to be axiomatically or self-evidently sort of prizeworthy or worth adulating or sort of trying to propagate, or just it consumes the mind essentially. It's sort of it is it's like a tinge that sort of has blotted out all the color and replaced it with just one strong, stark yearning and motivation. There's a very good description of lust in the Gita. I always forget this quote, but look it up up quickly, but anyway, let me just move on. So, and so it seemed, I mean, you know, the Scientology solution is that you basically you cut off the association or the like sort of you get that image and you kind of you cut it off at the top. You cut it as if it was a curtain, and you just sort of detached from it in quite a sort of a visceral meditation of sort of creative processing or sort of mock-up where you trust your own sort of ability to create, destroy, and sustain, you know, sort of your own internal organization of your side of the mind, and you clean up these child functions by basically evacuating them of these I keep on wanting to say attachments, I keep on wanting to say associations, but you know they do perhaps lead to associations in dominant functions and in parent in how parent functions relate to inferior functions, but in some sense that is the source of the compulsion behind those other sympathetic functions. And so anyway, I've basically what pontificating about this essentially means in practical terms is essentially the need to generate an independent alternative to the superego as the halfway house, as the but a very important halfway house, because in some sense I think the unconscious side of the mind will represent the kernel, the seed of a new personality. You know, it will be the mother of the new personality to some degree, and so the healing has to and the cleansing has to take place there in your principles in order to straighten and integrate the subconscious and then the ego and the subconscious. But and then that is the model that is capable of taking on sort of the last boss, the superego. Which I think the superego child function could even be said to be somewhat benevolent in some sense, and perhaps it doesn't have an image, because it is actually because unlike what I keep on calling the positive developments of, when I say positive, I don't mean as in good, I just mean as in like the metaphor of negative and positive images, that the positive elements, which is the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego, their child functions are actually particularized in a particular image, whereas I think that the superego's child function is a more abstract, cerebral. It doesn't have. I mean, I might be wrong, but I mean, I think that the child function in the superego is more nebulous, and this is part of the character of the superego, which is that it is almost philosophically and fundamentally invested in this kind of external locus of control. And the reason why I think that that's all true is because otherwise it wouldn't have been able to develop an ego that was like an avatar of an agent within a game, and the game master was the superego that was containing, that essentially that the superego is of a different quality to the other sides of the mind, in that it really is kind of it really does sort of take on this role of the god of the world. You know, sort of or that it is the agent of the god of the world, or that it is connected with the world. And in some sense, you know, I mean, this is also this requires very delicate doctrinal thinking and things like that, because the world is something that cannot, I would say, is a necessary function of spiritual life, because in the same way, and this is directly related to the concept of the spirit of man, that there are two spirits that went out into the world, the spirit of man and the spirit of God. And you need a world to precipitate the Son of Man, essentially. And the Son of Man is still going to be in the world. So yeah. And this might then mean that something like the lake of fire is a subset of the child function and the superego of because, as I've already said, that the child function and the superego is more abstract or broad, and that is what is creating this mantle of an external locus of control and falling under the spell of the god of the world, which is another name for the devil, or Satan, which I do also think is also another way of thinking about the spirit of man. Following the spirit of man is essentially this external locus of control. So I think that is only solved by having a particularized child function in the superego. But having a particularized child function in the superego, I don't think is. I think that might be generically a good way of formulating what being the Son of Man is, or having the Son of Man revealed, or the work of salvation, you know, uncovered. About to sneeze. No, okay. So there's a problem here, just that you know, this isn't the whole sort of picture, because this, I think the details of this only truly make sense within the dominant function of the superego, which then I think becomes the New Jerusalem. But yeah, I think sort of being able to catch yourself or anticipate the delineation or the demarcation within the child function of the superego, what kinds of fundamental orientation are leading one to act under the auspices of a generalized superego child function or an external locus of control, that one understands those sort of correlations, then you're sort of keeping yourself from the false prophet in the lake of fire. and you can see, you know, sort of, oh, that is the way of the false prophet, that, you know, that actually, that's the territory of the lake of fire within that child function in the superego. And so that is, I think, how you sort of keep yourself, is anyway, no, I think I need to go back and talk about, so anyway, that's an interesting theory for general therapy and self-actualization. Now, let me go back and see if I can, almost embarrassingly, retrace what I used to do to describe narcissism. I might be too dislocated from thinking about this. So I think what I was saying about narcissists is that their child function and their ego is and I need to think about this more. Because I've also been trying to think of somewhat new. You know, when I used to talk about the secret devotion and things like that, and how the oath has a virtual devotion inculcated within it. And it really is sort of quite complicated and weird. And I might have to fiddle with it quite a lot before I can find a precise formulation that seems to actually be empirically observable and verifiable. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying to see if I can salvage some of the subtype things in metagram, which I'm tormenting myself with at the moment, to see if I can find a basis for my sequences, or find some kind of empirically grounded grounding of those models, which need to be verified and checked. Yeah, I guess I'm too busy with that. I can't. I mean, I do think narcissism is worth thinking about. Pathological narcissism is worth thinking about as a way to see if these things can be uncovered in some sense, because, you know, it's finding the exceptions, finding the abnormal is a way to see some of the internal components of something. So yeah, I actually need to look at this stuff again, and develop slightly more permutations of how I see these subtypes functioning. This is something that I need to go back and talk about. So yeah, I do think that the child functions in the subconscious, unconscious, and ego are fundamentally different to the child function in the superego. I did say that already, but let me just explore how they are different. So, in some sense, the child functions of the subconscious, unconscious, and ego are all supportive in concert. They all sort of graph together in some sense, and although that they might run into some kind of cognitive dissonance that's going to happen on the level of the parent functions or on the level of the dominant functions, but that might have some kind of internal tug of war and negative feedback between themselves, blah, blah, blah. That's for them to work out. but I guess that's, after saying that, it's kind of hard to say that, but let's say theoretically, the child functions of these three sides of the mind, it seems to me that there's nothing intrinsic that would stop them from being coexistent, and I do think that they are meant to be reflections of one another in their particular constituency, in their particular role of how they are structurally or architecturally, sort of related to one another. And I do think that these child functions as well also, they can develop associative chains. In some sense, one image leads to another image, leads to another image, which is meant to sort of represent and inherit and inculcate the commitment to the last image, so that these are sort of image snapshots that are taken to be as equivalent to one another, or taken to be sort of having equal merit, or meaning the same thing, and that meaning being the source of value for that side of the mind. So it is kind of like the operational imperative for that side of the mind is inculcated within that kind of axiomatic image. And this is needed because the false ego complex is lacking a fundamental justification, or no, actually, scrap what I was just saying there, but where that fundamental justification comes in, actually, is how it relates to the superego's child function. That if you can look at all the child functions in the other sides of the mind, they are effectively images that form the quintessential condition of what value is. But the thing that is actually creating that value is the child function in the superego. The child function in the superego is actually the bank that is cashing those, or metaphorically speaking, analogously, is the underwriter, is the guarantor of those promises. That those values are real. And so the child function, the superego, is broader, is a formulation, is a formula of which you can then fragment it up or divvy it up into, the three positive sides of the mind and their particular, magisteria, each of their spheres of operation, contextualizing or interpreting, in some sense, the superego. But it is they're not all directly connected to the superego. They're perhaps all uniquely related to the superego, depending on the kind of the ontological flow, which might be a little bit unique between the different subtypes, because of how specifically the ego has to establish itself with some kind of virtual anchor in the rest of itself, in the rest of the positive sides of the mind, which haven't yet developed. So it has to kind of anticipate what those things are and use, and that's going to create a kind of internal messiness or sophistication. But let me just, in broad strokes, say that generally speaking, I would say that the ego child function is going to develop first. The subconscious child function is going to develop next, but the subconscious child function is probably going to be very young until the unconscious child function develops, and then all the child functions will be able to refine themselves in a way that wasn't possible before the unconscious starts getting itself properly developing. And so I do think that they will grow in their associative sophistications in terms of generating new images that are, as I say, like more refined. And you know, I wonder that eventually you would hope that through the growing up and the independence that is eventually offered by the unconscious side of the mind, that this grows eventually into a knife that is capable of cutting itself from the positive side of the mind, so much so that it's even capable of cutting back at the superego's child function and demarcating its toxicity. But before that, before perhaps diagnosing its fundamental toxicity, you can be aware of its general, what can I say, its general what was the word that I was just about to use, but sort of its general excesses, its general sort of decadence or fundamental, sort of flaw or sort of being suspicious that it's that it's inculcating or that it's a kind of got a propitiative fostering of dysfunctional and pathological essentially its general guidance that in terms of how it relates to the other child functions is a fundamentally or even just can be seen roughly as being an aberrative, sort of arbitrary, sort of capricious and haphazard influence over one's development. Obviously, this is only capable if you have enough of an independent, positively developed side of the false ego complex around the unconscious. That you have enough principled independence to that you're on the way to developing the knife that can cut itself. I do wonder if maybe some versions of pathological narcissism that the ego is not necessary. The ego of the narcissist is not necessarily like malformed, broken, and brittle, but that it's perhaps exceedingly cynical in that it has already seen a window of the future, that if it did develop a positive side of the mind that it really believed in, that it eventually it would amount into a discomportment with the superego, that it would sort of it would be creating a separate independent bastion of control that would potentially threaten the superego, and the superego that perhaps the ego of a pathological narcissist in very early ages has been I mean, this is what I'm about to say is wrong, but I have to say something like it's going to be something in this ballpark. But what I'm about to say is wrong because I just want to talk about the ego. But essentially, that their subconscious has been so fundamentally supplemented, as in that the mother has stampeded the development of the pathological narcissist's own subconscious. So they haven't been able to develop their own subconscious. They have been given the subconscious of the mother to be sort of imprinted, to have it imprinted and correlating to their ego. So their ego has been cynically charged with a kind of oversight and maturity, where it has no unconscious side of the mind developed at all to speak of, but it has such a caustic subconscious imprint that the superego, that the ego is entirely wary of the whole project of setting up its own independent subconscious, because it's got this kind of primer of having a subconscious, a very that empowers an ego, but they don't see any unconscious mediating factor between these structures. And so all they see is an unsupported as in they are seeing structures, they're seeing a template of a psychological schema that is going to be discomported or unsustained by the superego, and they can't anticipate an unconscious bastion of independence. And so they, in terms of so, I mean, I don't know how to describe this, but essentially then which causes them to lean into the superego and to, in some sense, commit to not developing their own subconscious, because that would be essentially an act of unsustainable insubordination to the source of validity which only the superego can provide, because they essentially have they can't anticipate the role that the unconscious would play in mediating between the subconscious and the ego. Yeah, I'd have to clean that up, but that's basically the core concept there. Okay, yeah, let me just stop this recording. There's a lot of stuff I have to sort of meditate on anyway. Okay, so I'm just going to elaborate some of the themes of what I've just spoken about. So I think that what I've been discussing to some degree dovetails well with Sam Vaknin, in his recording Narcissist Outsourced Existence, Trauma Bonded Fantasy with You, which he's saying a lot of things that I think I have also spoken about in my own models. But that the kinds of outsourced existence, but also the other tactics which he talks about, one of which is displaced existence, where people take pride in possessing other people in some sense, but they're proud for themselves because of the accomplishments or the esteem of another person. I think that all of these tactics are essentially grounded in the absence of the unconscious side of the mind. That there are no principles to speak of in some sense, but I just wanted to point out that I think this kind of I think on some level it's also perhaps an aspect of sort of magical thinking to some degree, or sort of confabulation of sort of poor reality testing and stuff like that, is I just want to draw this back to a thing that I think that these are all elements of juvenile, young, developmental issues that people grow through, as very young children. That in some sense, and some people never develop enough principled thinking to kind of get out of that developmental hole that everyone generally has to grow through. That it is not guaranteed that individuals develop the independence of their subconscious rooted in their unconscious set of principles. That, and many people that seemingly do that, I think, don't necessarily have that real principled independence. They have it supplemented with a kind of, I used this term kind of a lot, cerebral histrionics. They believe in a narrative. They believe in determinism or fatalism. This is how very undeveloped, immature, sort of stunted people that, sort of are stuck in some kind of toxic version of Keegan stage 3, sort of grift as very intellectual sort of philosophers and, sort of cerebral pseudo-intellectuals that create a whole sympathetic ideology around some kind of system or plan of some narrative or some ideology that needs to sort of be policed by the social order, blah, blah, blah. So you have a kind of, instead of having a principle, you have a kind of a sociological plan of action. You have a sociological script that you want to have enforced, that there's a kind of, essentially some kind of buttress to the ego, to universalizing the ego, to expanding the ego into some kind of umbrella that the territory, sort of, it just is part of the atmosphere of the kind of the cosmos, or of this mythological piece of blood and soil, or something like that, that you have a mythology instead of principles, which obviously leads to horrible developmental conundrums where, it perpetuates itself, sort of in the same way that totalitarianism or fascism sort of replicates itself at quite a high degree. In the way that Luigi Zoja described Hitler as being a socially successful paranoid. If you have a conspiracy theory that's unpopular, maybe you get put in a mental institution. But if you have a conspiracy theory that is popular, then maybe you're the leader of a political party. Especially if the conspiracy theory is centered around, sort of everything is controlled by some identity or group of people or something like that, then you have this, again, you have an incentive not to develop principles of governing your life through, sort of systematic thinking and principles. And a cohesive systemic understanding of things. You can just kind of brush that and divert that into a narrative of some kind of, grand polemic or oppositional emergency and sort of I should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm talking about so many things, it's hard to weave these things in, but I think that there are, within my theory of emotional tones, which are all constructed out of cognitive inflections, there are two emotional tones which are fundamentally potentially noxious. They do have their place within pedagogy and within, let's say, necessary relations of dealing with the young and inexperienced, and dealing with educational structures where you can't just tell everyone everything and have everything on that. You can't be transparent about knowledge, when you're dealing with very, very young minds that can only consume so much or something like that. You have to have some gradient of development. And so, but there are two things that I think are almost pose as kind of spiritual danger and a fundamental, and in some sense they also show that developing principles and developing independence is something that is not, it almost sort of requires time and experience. It requires real participation. It can't just be done sort of purely intellectually or something like that. These two emotional tones are shy and rushed. And I would say that all the evils of the world, all the fundamental problems that we run into are all based on providing sympathy to shy and rushed, in some sense innate or enforced cultures that place people in the valence of being shy or rushed, so that there is essentially not proper understanding. Because those two emotional tones are relevant because the one involves the absence of moderation, or SI4, and the other one involves the absence of placidity, or FI2. And those are very fundamentally important cognitive functions. SI4 I link spiritually to the water, and FI2 I link to the spirit itself and to spiritual understanding. And so if you're rushed, you can't have spiritual understanding. You're actually specifically negating spiritual understanding if you're being rushed. But this is the thing, sometimes for the purposes of time you need to be rushed or something like that, in instances that involve sort of pedagogy, or that it does actually take time. If you don't have that time, then maybe you have to be rushed. And shyness as well is almost like is kind of, again, like you can understand why people would be shy about something, because it's you can't deal with everything at the same time or the same place or something like that. So, you know, if it's not yet time, if it's not yet the proper place, then, you know, so you're shy about it. But in some sense, it is a lack of moderation, and in some, you know, it's interesting because you can link this biblically. You know, that sort of it's interesting within my emotional tones that cautiousness, that cautious is an emotional tone that will actually precipitate shyness, and cautiousness is also involves the anyway. I don't want to talk too much about this, but let me just go back. So, cautious is liberty, or NI12, in the with the absence of discerning or hope, TI9. So and that will a counter offer to cautious is shy. So if someone's being cautious, you can be sympathetic with them, or reactive to them, by being shy. Then you can preserve your TI9, you can preserve your hope or your discerning, but at the cost of moderation, of what ought to be, SI4. Anyway, that's not the only. I mean, shyness then can also. So I mean, in some sense, you can probably say that shy emotional tones have a projection of cautious on the environment, perhaps, but shy is not the. It can also be a counter offer to the silly emotional tone. But anyway, you can see the tendrils of drama, how this is all of this stuff is karmic relationships. Emotional tones always relate to karmic disposition, but anyway, I do just think that, therefore, in terms of the residual mounting effects of karma, I do think that there are particular spiritual dangers around shy and rushed, because if you're shy and rushed, the lack of moderation and the lack of placidity, or FI2, and moderation is SI4, the lack of the water and the lack of the spirit can eventually lead into fundamental sort of breakpoints, or sort of bottlenecks of sort of mounting problems. And that this is, I think, how cultures become decrepit and obtuse, and sort of have a kind of corruption inculcated within them. And I mean, I just thought that, anyway, I mean, this is somewhat related to when you have, so I mean, I criticize and I talk a lot about what I don't like about so-called Christian belief systems and other religious belief systems, and I came up with this little sort of aphorism that sheep are not supposed to be shy, and the meek are not rushed. So I mean, this is not an entirely true statement. I'm just trying to make this as a vague, because a lot of religious things are, I think, in some sense, so poor in their understanding. They're so low quality in their doctrine and in their teaching that they seem to impose
a kind of shyness so that no one will actually pierce the veil of the stupidity and the stupor, and they have disgusting dogma and teaching that, sort of, well, to be meek and to be humble and to be subservient and to just accept without thinking, that, so that they rush their followers and they give them these toxic definitions, oh, be like a child, be like a child, as if these people have no experience of what children are actually like. Their version of what a child is a child after they have been abused by an authoritarian parent. That's what they think be like a child means. Have you never experienced what children actually are? I mean, it's so twisted in, they have they have reimagined the whole basic lexicon of the human experience to comport with their disgusting toxic ideology. And essentially, I think that a lot of that can be generally cut through by, I mean, and again, this aphorism that I've just sort of, or this maxim is probably not such a good maxim, because it's a bit of an obtuse narrative in itself, and it's not true in every respect. But I mean, I think that if you can just see what I'm illustrating, that the sheep are not shy and the meek are not rushed. Is just sort of my corrective, my general corrective antidote to dispelling some of these sort of tropes. But neither should that be, because you can't just try to do the opposite, or it eventually runs into. I think the more important thing is just being conscious when you are being these things and knowing that they need to be cleaned up at some later point then, which is in some sense what is necessary within pedagogy or education. Anyway, I think I've dealt with this enough, but and why did I go down this rabbit hole? Is because it relates to principles in the unconscious side of the mind. Yeah, so it is interesting, because I think that I am making a sort of a generalized claim, and this is quite a strange claim, that people are involved in drama that is essentially stopping them from reaching the independence needed of the kind of spiritual metaphysical education needed in order to have an internal locus of control strong enough that they can actually, sort of, this is, I think, probably connected also to sort of the Aristotelian version of the good life in ethics, which I think to some degree I generally endorse the general sort of structure, but which I think also comports well with the sort of the Kantian model of the good life to some degree, although I probably have some caveats, but I mean that general model I think I generally am happy with. But anyway, I think the reason why it's generally regarded that we need sort of a civilization or a society to help educate us within the conforms of of structures and systems and things like that, is because they allow us to more readily be confronted with principles, and to allow us to internally organize ourselves, using these sophisticated mechanisms of mediating social structures that are hopefully provide lots of dignity and integrity to the individual constitution of people, so that they can overcome what are the perennial gatekeepers of developing proper maturity and growing up, which I do think is shy and rushed. Shy, you can create a whole culture which is premised on making people shy and keeping them rushed, and then they can just follow along to the narrative, and that they can be, raised like cattle. And I think that in some sense that these might not be the only gatekeepers. I mean, one might be also stuck in other sort of things. But I think that the shy and the rushed are, let's say, the spiritual gatekeepers in the direct sense. But I mean, obviously, any kind of karmic drama can probably be sufficient to tie oneself up. So all the other emotional tones can also conspire against you. But I think that in terms of one of the more esoteric and fundamental perennial gatekeepers of having a properly dignified culture is getting rushed and shy under some kind of cultural. You need a sophisticated enough culture that is sensitive to, sort of not being taken over and sort of gerrymandered or jerry-rigged into sort of enforcing kind of a shy or rushed orthodoxy. As because those things can sort of always excuse themselves, or those are perennial excuses to keep people undeveloped or and so I do think that all of the slave moralities have these two emotional tones prominent in their, somewhat woven into their basic psychological schema. Anyway, I just thought that that's worth having put down in having some recorded version of that.